Hello, everybody. We have already a number of people in the audience. I want to welcome all of you. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Iván Chaar López is an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Tomás Guarna, a doctoral student at Stanford University and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Iván in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Tomás will tell us more about Iván's research and career in just a minute. Then Iván will present his work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. Tomás will moderate. And at the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Tomás, the screen is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Professor Boczkowski, for the introduction. And it's an honor for me to introduce Iván Chaar López, who is an assistant professor in digital studies in the Department of American Studies at University of Texas at Austin, where he leads the Border Tech Lab. Dr. Chaar López's research focuses on the place of Latinx as targets, users, and developers of digital life worlds. His first book, The Cybernetic Border, Drones, Technology, and Intrusion, concerns intersecting histories of electronic technology and manned aerial systems and boundary making along the US-Mexico border, and is under contract with Duke University Press. He's also developing a second book project that examines the history and technopolitics of electronic manufacturing along the US-Mexico borderlands since the 1960s. His peer-reviewed work has been published in American Scholarly, Social Studies of Science, Social Text, and Critical Ethnic Studies, and has appeared in The Guardian, Interactions, the Magazine for Association of Computer Machinery, Political, and Bloomberg Business Week. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chaar López.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Tomás, for that introduction. And it's been an honor to be a part of, it's an honor actually to be a part of the virtual seminars organized by the Center for Latinx Digital Media. I've had a fantastic experience listening to previous speakers and learning from their work. So I want to thank Professor Pablo Boczkowski for the invitation to share my research with the center. I also want to thank Facundo Suenzo for all his efforts coordinating this event these past few months. And lastly, I want to thank you all for making the time to attend today's talk. So let me share my screen. That's not what I want. So I want to make sure that the screen is showing my slides.
Yes.
And are they changing?
Yes.
Sounds good. Great. So what I'm about to share comes from my book, The Cybernetic Border, Drones, Technology, and Intrusion. And I've been working on this project for the past 8 years through archival research, oral history interviews with artists and researchers, and a lot of digital archives as well. So the book historically examines the emergence of a socio-technical arrangement for border enforcement since the mid-20th century, anchored in information technologies and infrastructures. And by these technologies, I mean seismic, ground sensors, unmanned aerial systems, and communications equipment, just to mention 3 kind of broad categories. So in the book and in today's talk, this is what I called the cybernetic border. It is a regime organized through recursive practices of data capture, storage, processing, circulation, and communication. So some of you might wonder about visual techniques represented by the operation of cameras and drone video surveillance. And these, tend to garner greater attention in public debate and scholarship. But this talk, however, argues that these techniques are part of a greater assemblage designed to structure, organize, and materialize routines of border enforcement. These routines and feedback loops integrate the visual just as much as the oral or the electromagnetic. The cybernetic border is an abstract and abstracting regime where sovereignty and information technologies are mutually contingent. The use of technoscience in border enforcement highlights that the border is not some line in the sand, to quote an important scholar of the US-Mexico border, or some transparently enforced policy prescription. These technologies are the matter of the cybernetic border. They are producing the border. So today I'll talk about my research into the cybernetic border, first by giving an overview of the book project, stating the problem, going over a bit of the methods and the frameworks that I mobilize throughout the book. And also I'll give a summary of the chapters. After that, we'll move into the case of the electronic fence, which is discussed in more depth in the book's 2nd chapter, just to give you a sense of how the cybernetic border is articulated in a particular historical moment. So if the cybernetic border is sounding a bit abstract, I want to tell you a story. So longtime computer and tech enthusiast Stephen Levy was impressed when a Samsung Gear virtual reality or VR headset immersed him in a digital world that simulated what he called the exact view that he just enjoyed in real life. So the headset was part of a surveillance system called Lattice. It's still part of that system, in fact. And Lattice is an artificial intelligence sensor fusion platform with network sensor towers and small unmanned aerial systems, or UASs, that are collecting, processing, and communicating data. So through these headsets, the Texan Desert Valley appeared in virtual form, transcoded into data processed by the platform. 3 glowing green squares called attention to a person, 88%, another person, 93%, and a car, 91%. Now that is the exact view that was enhanced. It was reconfigured by statistical processes assessing the humanity of entities in the desert landscape. Information processing parsed out the barrage of environmental data, separating human from non-human and making the human a target for potential removal from US territory. The demonstration was set up by Anduril Industries, and it was meant to highlight how the solution to the perennial problem of border control came down to data and information technologies. The matter of the border is as much a technological question as it is a cultural one. Stories give shape to the kinds of material arrangements through which borders are made, just as material arrangements embody and pursue political objectives and make possible the performance of distinct stories. Anduril Industries takes its name, for example, from Aragorn's enchanted blade in the fantasy novel series of The Lord of the Rings. Anduril is a sword that defends the world from darkness, from the evil forces of Lord Sauron, from orcs and trolls, all recurrent literary tropes of a particular racial worldview. And technologies developed by Andrew are meant to protect the world of men, a world where humanity is narrowly coded through the alabaster imagination of J.R.R. Tolkien. So according to CEO Brian Schimpf, Anduril Industries developed the Lattice system to be a, quote, smart wall to get information in the hands of Border Patrol agents, end quote. Even though borders as walls and fences take precedence in most debates, Border Patrol officials and their corporate allies know they are not the end-all be-all of border enforcement. They believe that agents need situational awareness. This is a military concept developed since the mid-20th century, but that garner a greater emphasis and attention in the 1990s. And having situational awareness means understanding borderland conditions in time and place to better respond to them. So just like Anduril, the flame of the West, stood between the world of men and the racialized dangers from the East, the network platform of Lattice also produces boundaries and geopolitical borders. And it does so through data. It is an information regime drawing boundaries around bodies classified as threats to the US nation and making possible practices of immobilization like apprehension, incarceration, and deportation in the name of security. Now, my book, The Cybernetic Border, offers a sustained examination of UASs, ground sensors, and other information technologies deployed in border enforcement for over half a century. These artifacts, like walls and fences, not only help maintain the demarcation of national boundaries, but they also create them through their relation to operations. Information technologies are operational because they play key roles in organizing underground efforts by actors. They allow border enforcement operations to be multi-sided, concerted, dynamic, and interconnected. Operational technologies, in other words, speaks to the process of datafication of border enforcement. By investigating operational technologies, my book interrogates the epistemological and procedural relations of the cybernetic border and their investments in information. To give you a bit of kind of the methods and frameworks that I draw from for the book, ideas about race, citizenship, and the nation shaped the formation of an increasingly restrictive immigration regime in the US since the turn of the 19th century. American and ethnic studies scholars have shown that racial difference has informed how border officials govern the degrees of inclusion and exclusion by which subjects can participate and belong or not to the US imagined community. My book contributes to this scholarship by studying governmental approaches to the border through networks of material inscriptions. And by these, I mean imaginaries and practices such as Immigration and Naturalization Service, policy documents, reports to Congress, journalistic reports, enforcement techniques, operational footage, and a lot more. So these networks of inscriptions are constitutive and representative of enumerative practices which sort, group, and divide people into classified quantities. Intrusion detection sensors and drones detect and record border incursions. These are translated into data and as such are automatically processed and sorted through predetermined classificatory schema that privilege the policing of some bodies over others. Networks of material inscriptions are meant to render these bodies legible to intervention. The archival materials that support this book, especially those produced through intricate bureaucratic work, require a reflexive understanding of archival logics. Archives are, after all, a rough field of force and will to power, where some bodies and some ways of knowing are made legible while others are not. Imperial archives, such as those that document the operations of US state making, are products of political power. Tedious descriptions and retellings, bureaucratic squabbles, and pursuits of precision and their violences. So engaging bureaucratic thought work creates opportunity to scrutinize the routine production of orders that bind differentiated wholes together. The practices examined in the book shape the conditions of knowing, the kinds of bodies, identities, and imaginaries that can be made perceptible and accountable. Systems of written accountability, as anthropologist Anne Laura Stoller concludes, call for elaborate infrastructures, paper trails of weekly reports to superiors, summaries of reports, and recommendations based on reports that all call for systematic coding systems by which they can be tracked. So control, in other words, emerges, or at least actors hope, through categorical and technological sorting through networks of inscriptions. When it came to the artifacts of the cybernetic border, like drones, intrusion detection systems, computing, and smart borders, I was challenged to figure out how to do research with a ruptured and dispersed archive whose materials speak not of a singular object, but different versions of the same one. Archival materials generated by different institutions, companies, and people all strove to coordinate the multiple objects they created to make them into stable and legible entities. And by this, I mean unmanned aerial systems used early in the 2000s were not the same unmanned aerial systems used in the later 2000s, or even the ones that are used today. So all these variations from one system to another are part of what they are negotiating, what bureaucrats are negotiating as they are producing the cybernetic border. So these materials work to reconfigure space and peoples into neatly ordered entities folded into the world made by technological objects and that the materials themselves made. But don't confuse this presumed neatness with the actual imperial disorder of things that is governing the US-Mexico border. Incompleteness in the archive at the heart of my book was intensified by the classification regime of modern state-making. Access to materials that speak to certain enforcement operations and technologies are, after all, restricted. So I was even turned away when I attempted to gain access to someone within a drone manufacturer. So this pushed me, quite literally in a sense and metaphorically, to track what actors in different sectors and constituencies discussed, and in doing so, recompose the stories they had for a particular socio-technical arrangement. So I draw together the distributed archive by engaging its materials as techno-scientific scenes. Actors design the cybernetic border with specific roles in mind for entities. Some perform the role of hunters or predators, and others that of the prey or target. These are among the technopolitics of the cybernetic border. And by that I mean the kinds of political goals and imaginaries that technologies are meant to pursue or enact. Materials produced by actors help me retrieve the scripts that assign entities their different roles. These scripts are the scenes or scenarios played by human and non-human actors. They are retrieved through descriptions contained in the likes of technical reports, system diagrams, demonstrations, and footage of operations. Descriptions bring forward the kinds of prescriptions that validate distinct behaviors and dissuade others, and also validate and dissuade particular socio-technical relations in the making of national borders and sovereignty. So through its methods and theoretical frameworks, the book is drawing on insights from US border and immigration history, the literature on imperial formations, science and technology studies, and digital studies. The persistent presence of science and technology in border making and border enforcement suggests a pressing need to understand the roles, the material relations they produce, as well as the semiotic and symbolic relations that they produce. So the chapters throughout the book reconstruct techno-scientific scenes that help interpret the technopolitics of the cybernetic border regime. Chapters 1 through 3 scrutinize the prescriptions performed during Air Force military exercises, which you see here in the slide as the picture on the left, top left. I also talk about in chapter 2 about the operation of the intrusion detection system in the 1970s, which was used against Mexicans. That's the focus of today's talk. And I also talk about in chapter 3, I talk about the experimental deployment of UASs in border enforcement since the War on Terror. Now, the scripts that I talk about in these chapters, like those in the demonstration of Andrew Slatis, revealed the biopolitical project of the US Empire Nation in its treatment of indigenous peoples, Latina, Latino, Latine, Arab, and Muslim migrants, and authorized border crossers as enemies of the nation. So treated as enemies, these populations were pushed towards a mode of social existence that made them into expendable lives. They mattered only to the extent that they justified the construction and operations of the cybernetic border. Chapter 4 flips the script of those first 3 chapters. And it does so by exploring the limitations of the techno-aesthetics of the cybernetic border. And by this, I mean how this regime sought to reconfigure human sensory experience through data routines. To pay attention to the limitations of techno-aesthetics, I look into the works of Alex Rivera, Humane Borders, Ricardo Dominguez, Ian Allen Paul, Kate Chandler, and Josh Begley. And they use operational technologies to contest the sovereign project of borders, of making territory and people. But more importantly, their work generates an opening that moves beyond the constructs of nations and the recurrence of enmity. So let's turn now to a specific case to understand how the cybernetic border came into being. And that is the case of the electronic fence. And I think it's an important case to kind of talk about today because it demonstrates 2 core claims of the book. One is the datafication of border enforcement and the racial politics. That's the second, the racial politics of information infrastructures. So border operations were transformed through the integration of information technologies and the abstracting influence of cybernetics. The US-Mexico border of the 1970s was one of the critical spaces where government and non-government actors reconfigured the foreign and the domestic through experiments in automation, experiments in biopolitics, and the production of the territory. So let me tell you another story to show you what I mean. For 2 straight days, sensor number 139 sent radio signals to the Border Patrol's station in San Isidro, California. A light flashed intermittently, as if someone or something activated it. To Border Patrol agents, the sensor's uninterrupted activation was a clear sign that it was malfunctioning. The light for sensor number 103, by contrast, was off when it suddenly turned on. Data of its activation were displayed on a screen that mapped out the locations of sensors and automatically recorded these data on a magnetic tape back at sector headquarters. And at sector headquarters, there was a desk officer that radioed the nearest patrol car. So minutes later, the New York Times reported in 1973, 3 Mexicans attempting to sneak into the United States were tracked down and caught as a result of the electronic detection system installed along the Mexican border. The system described by the New York Times journalist was commonly known as the electronic fence. It relied on the operation of different components: ground sensors, radio waves and transmitters, signal processors, computers, magnetic tapes, and Border Patrol agents, among others. It was a far cry from the patrol inspector of 50 years ago, agents reflected, who rode miles of desert on horseback or who walked miles of towed roads or border slash on snowshoes in search of footprints to track down illegal aliens, end quote. Sensors were programmed to detect different kinds of phenomena, from seismic sensors measuring the applied stress of footsteps to infrared sensors that measured body heat. All components of the electronic fence were meant to work in concert to monitor, record, and circulate information of those the INS recorder, which is where I got this diagram from, called intruders. Now, I'll soon explain a bit more of how the electronic fence worked, But first, I want us to kind of briefly consider who were these intruders, who participated in the targeting of intruders, and how did the intrusion detection system come together as a technique of border control. Actors participated in enacting the politics of classification when they tethered the problem of border control and intruders to what they thought were unruly Mexicans. After the end of the Bracero program in 1964 and passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, anxious federal officials and engineers struggled to control the border. A few statistics can help understand the situation. So in 1963, the Border Patrol, which is the enforcement arm of INS, or Immigration Naturalization Service, they located around 21,000 deportable aliens who attempted entry without inspection across the border. 10 years later, in 1973, that number rose to more than 500,000 deportable aliens for an average increase of about 41% per year. In the span of a decade, the total number of apprehended deportable aliens on the US-Mexico border was almost 2 million. In the 1970s, the US public imagined the southern border as overrun by thousands of migrants. And if you pay attention to these statistics, you can see why people are thinking this way. INS officials and the public at large, as the following headlines on this slide show, associated deportable aliens to the southern border, and more specifically, to Mexicans. They were the intruders, quote unquote, drawn in the INS reporter's diagram. They were the targets of intrusion detection systems. And the category of intruders was bound to the work that Border Patrol officers did. It enforced the boundaries of the nation by sorting who was allowed entry into and who must be excluded from the US. In classifying unauthorized border crossers and Mexicans as intruders, federal officials and engineers developed an elaborate technical apparatus that naturalized their subject positions as exogenous to the nation. The category was encoded with a racial imaginary positing ethnic Mexicans as inherently suspect, as foreign to the US nation, despite more than a century of presence within its territory, and despite the fact that many of ethnic Mexicans actually held US citizenship. So the electronic fence installed in multiple sectors of the US border in the 1970s was also linked to US military engagements in Vietnam in the previous decade. One of the main problems the US military confronted then was the surreptitious movements of Viet Cong fighters within South Vietnam and of North Vietnamese forces across the country's borders. As the war grew in intensity during the mid-1960s, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara tasked a group of academic scientists known as the Jason Committee to propose a solution to the military's Southeast Asian problem. They recommended the creation of an information system. And at its most basic, the system consisted of electronic sensors, signal processors, and electronic transmitters that were placed along the demilitarized zone. And the goal of this system was to prevent infiltration. Here I'm quoting from a report to Congress, prevent infiltration and supply from North Vietnam across South Vietnam's 43-mile frontier. So future iterations of the McNamara line, which is as this system was known in the public, integrated computers to accelerate the analysis and circulation of intruder data, and that data categorized and sorted things like site of intrusion, rate of movement, and direction. So actors involved in developing the McNamara line were soon entangled with INS, as together they produced the intrusion detection system and a distinct border technopolitical regime. Research and development of the McNamara line recruited a network of academic partners at the MITRE Corporation and the Syracuse Research Corporation. MITRE was founded in 1958 as a federally funded research center, and initially, most of its workers were transferred from MIT's Lincoln Laboratory. On the other hand, the Syracuse Research Corporation was a nonprofit research and development company founded in 1957 by Syracuse University. The system used by the Army in Vietnam was partially developed at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And Fort Huachuca was a former frontier outpost during the settlement of the Southwest in the late 19th century. And one journalist described Fort Huachuca as a quote, an army post originally established to chase down intransigent Indians, end quote. So decades later, in the popular imaginary, the military post continued to be an instrument against the enemies of the settler colonial project. While INS did not directly fund research and development of what became the electronic fence, it did offer the military and its partners with experimental space to test and improve the system in 1970. In addition to obtaining access to detection techniques developed by the Pentagon's academic partners, INS was also involved with electronics manufacturers. From 1970 to 1976, Sandia Corporation, Magnavox, and Teledyne Geotech were three of the electronics manufacturers that supplied expert knowledge and ground sensors for the electronic fence. And throughout all of this period, from 1970 to about 1976, INS spent about $8.7 million in the electronic fence. And though the amount spent in intrusion detection systems accounted for a minute fraction of the budget, it set the conditions of possibility for, on the one hand, future collaborations between the Pentagon and INS, and two, on the other, for continued reliance on electronic technology for border control. Now, I want to talk now a bit about cybernetics. So cybernetics provided some of the ideas that were at the core of the McNamara Wall, and they soon found their way into INS to answer the logistical challenge of border control. A product of the Second World War's military academic industrial complex, cybernetics was a scientific study of communication and control mechanisms in organisms and machines. And this knowledge formation offered a vocabulary through which to make sense of the border and address the failures of the immigration system. So cyberneticians contended that all systems relied on feedback mechanisms that processed informational inputs and produced outputs. The outputs were fed back into the system to steer its behavior towards its objective. Purposeful behavior was governed through these feedback mechanisms. Among the central concepts for cybernetics, as you can already tell, are systems, feedback, input, output, information, communication, control, purpose, and behavior, just to mention a few. Now, these terms, which came from combining language from the disciplines of engineering and psychology, became metaphors through which to order and make sense of the world, of flesh and metal, of nerves and wires, of channels and noise. And as a result, they allowed actors to blur the boundaries between the human and non-human. INS worked to reorganize the functioning of its policing force by translating their practices as a specific and ordered flow of information. And here we're going to start to see these cybernetic ideas kind of filter into INS. In an assessment of what they called the Border Patrol subsystem, the agency's Office of Planning and Evaluation, or PNE, described the different components and operations at the heart of the prevention system. The practices of prevention in this subsystem comprised three key facets. First, there was an input. Second, there was a processor. And third, there was an output. All activity began when the system was triggered by the input. And the input, as this diagram shows, is, I quote, aliens contemplating illegal entry and those who have entered illegally and have not yet been employed, end quote. Prevention, in other words, revolved around the actions of aliens entering the country without authorization. Engaging these subjects required that Border Patrol agents employ a variety of processor practices like line watch, sign cutting, and air patrol. By reframing these techniques and technologies as processors, INS officials construed them as clearly identifiable and standardized methods of action designed to generate a legible goal or output. And among the outputs of processors were the apprehension of aliens or their avoidance of border patrol prevention operations. So each of these outputs prompted the activation of different systems, such as removal or detection. Now, as this diagram highlights, the fact that well after INS installed the electronic fence and made use of a range of electronic technology in 1970, well after that fact, officials had sought to manufacture the field of the borderlands as a coherent and structured space of information. Diagrams like the Border Patrol subsystem draw relations. They visually describe how entities relate, under what conditions, and to what ends. Diagrams in this case, I think of them as configurations, like plans. They are structured and structuring artifacts that guide how actors comport themselves and how situations are interpreted. The prevention diagram enacts a perceptibility that was historically situated within a Western tradition of knowledge making, a vast infrastructure designed to know, that is, to produce and control subjects. It produced each entity involved in prevention as discrete and manageable, as a routine. The prevention diagram programs relations of subjection to the sovereign knowing subject, their right to know and their right to differentially manage mobility in space. P&E's diagram, in other words, configured border operations as a carefully built loop of circular causation, with distinct entities inhabiting the once incontrollable zone. Unauthorized border crossers were bound to the routine operations of processors, which fed them into other areas of the larger immigration system. The out-of-control borderlands is described as an abstract problem of inputs, processors, and outputs, though it is now posited as a cybernetic, self-maintained system. Armed with a range of techniques and methods of action, INS officials, especially Border Patrol agents, are reassuringly back in control. Or at least this is how the diagram imagines it, right? Immobilizing the language of cybernetics, the diagram shows how INS configure the boundaries of prevention within an informational flow. Information was the difference that made a social difference when integrated into the Border Patrol subsystem. Border enforcement was structured then in operational and informational terms. Some might interpret the processor practice included in the diagram as an evident sign that enforcement followed a border optic, but I would caution against such formulations. Enforcement practices like river or line watch, air patrol, and traffic check clearly involved ocular inspection. They engaged the borderlands environment through the materiality of vision and the logics of visibility, of producing, as STS call it, or in Halpern suggest, evidence about bodies, subjects, and populations. But what the prevention diagram demonstrates is that P&E treated these technologies of visions as processor practices. In doing so, they were incorporated within a larger and more abstract technopolitical regime that relied on a broader perceptual field and prioritized information as both an object and a biopolitical vector. Cybernetics was a spatializing governmentality for the way it constituted a layered field within which its entities were identified and described. That is, within this field, entities were produced, managed, and administered through categories like aliens or deportable aliens or intruders, and practices like sign cutting and traffic check. So the prevention system differentially governed entities as information. Cybernetics emphasized that systems depended on information to execute its control mechanisms. And intrusion detection systems like the one mapped by the INS reporter were designed to expand the reach of the Border Patrol by automatically monitoring and recording accurate information and phenomena. These super sensitive devices, INS officer Robert Seitz held, allow one officer monitoring the control box to cover a far wider territory than could be observed on ordinary still watch. through the use of the device, he can call in-patrol units to areas where the instrument indicates movement. Ground sensors placed on different border locations multiply the capacity of agents to detect the presence of intruders. These, in turn, were shaped by the technology into data-producing subjects, data inputs of a border information system that I've called the cybernetic border. So no longer hidden, intruders and their actions are now perceived and recorded by a system attuned to their existence. And I'm looking over at the time, and I want us to have time for conversation. So I'm gonna go over quite quickly here for a moment, just to kind of give you a sense of what I was gonna talk about, and then give a final kind of summary statement. So here I'm showing how the Border Patrol practice of sign cutting. Border Patrol defined this practice as recognizing and interpreting physical signs of the movement and activities of persons who have crossed the border without inspection. So this comes from a training manual of theirs. This practice is now automated, this human labor is transferred into the ground sensors that are now doing this kind of decoding of messages imprinted in the natural landscape. So even though sign cutting predates the use of these kinds of information systems, you can already tell that they are thinking in informational terms. So that kind of allows, I think, that allows for the integration of information technologies, because they're already transforming and translating natural phenomena and a range of phenomena into this kind of abstract processes of informations, inputs, outputs, processors, etc. So here's an image of virtual frequency discriminators. Variance frequency discriminators, and these are part of the system of ground sensors, and they are able to discriminate due to pattern recognition. They're able to differentiate between rain, between helicopters, cars, discriminate between cattle and humans, or so Border Patrol officers would like. There are multiple stories and instances where they actually fail in identifying, correctly identifying what is there. So let me go to the conclusion. So as an early articulation of the cybernetic border, the electronic fence was the product of sovereign practices just as much as it was the producer of sovereign practices like enforcement. Data were simultaneously the objects and vectors of the intrusion detection system. Bodies of data and data bodies structured relations of nation-making. The electronic fence is part of what international relations scholar Antoine Bousquet calls the logistics of perception, or the organization of the perceptual field in modern warfare through the systematic collection, storage, and transmission of information. The logistics of perception operate through technoaesthetics by arranging the sensible and the epistemological grounds for engaging the world. Human-machine configurations of the electronic fence striated land and bound subjects through quantification, computation, and probability. The electronic fence set the conditions for the cybernetic border as an epistemological order of things and beings, designating the legal categories of rule and their exceptions. Unauthorized border crossers and Border Patrol agents are differently subjected to its flows. Some have resisted it, others maintained it, and even others have sought to avoid being brought into its modular fold. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Chaar López, for such an interesting presentation. And we will now proceed to a Q&A. We will use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I see that some questions are already popping up there, but there is a Q&A button, and in the bottom of the Zoom screen, you guys can press there and ask questions. I'll take the prerogative of asking the first one, if that's okay, which is that, so when you were showing this very interesting screenshot of Lattice, and it had the probability that each image belonged to a person, or I think a dog, or other things that were probably there. And that made me wonder throughout the presentation, when you're tracing this informational thought or this way of understanding things as signals or as cybernetic thought, I understand that there's probably a switch from a deterministic thought of, as I see something, I think it is there, to a probabilistic thought, right? Like it is 90% probable that this person is a migrant or this person like has some. And I'm wondering, do you trace that? And if so, do you think it influences the enforcement techniques in any way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Thomas. So part of what intrusion detection systems like the electronic fence and the Lattice platform does is that it is recording incursions into the borderlands. And for a long time, INS and now DHS, Department of Homeland Security, they've struggled to figure out how many people are actually crossing without authorization. So these systems are a way to actually generate a record and generate data on this phenomenon. But in the end, these systems, I mean, I start with a story of a failure of a sensor that is triggering and is alerting of a supposed presence, and it's only the other sensor that actually succeeds in notifying a presence. So I start with that to show that these systems are often failing in myriad ways and aren't necessarily recording all the phenomena. So there are things that are escaping it, that are, I think of them as data haunts, that are kind of falling into the shadows and kind of messing up the system itself. So I'm saying all of this because these systems are supposed to record the data. Then the data is supposed to back up the policy to then figure out how many Border Patrol agents to move, how many systems to deploy, what kind of resources to use, and all of that. But in the end, they don't quite know how many people are crossing. So they have to then turn into models, into probability models to try to imagine how many people are moving. And that's the only part where I'm thinking about probability and model making. And that occurs in the 1970s, but it's an unfinished, unsettled controversy. It's still ongoing, and they still have no reliable model to use in determining how many people are crossing without authorization. So that's where I see the probability happening in a historical manner, which is slightly different than the probability of determining if that's a human or not a human, etc.
No, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Really appreciate that. We have a question from Salvador Herrera. He says, great talk, Iván, regarding the technopolitical scripts encoded into border surveillance systems. Could you say more about how automated data collection accounts for the human specifically? Is this a problem of racialized notion of citizenships that are too restrictive, or of a separation in between the human as a knowing subject and the non-human?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Salvador. So let me think about it, because it's a great question. Yeah, so part of what's happening in the 1970s, and it's still happening today, is that a lot of these systems are justified as a way to augment or to expand the reach of Border Patrol enforcement operations. So they are seen in this kind of like McLuhan like extensions of the human. And they're also seen as a way to have a more reliable decoder of borderland information. So the human is seen as someone who kind of messes up at times in figuring out what's happening on the ground. I have an article actually on this, which is on the LAMICA, the green card, and how it was automated also in the 1970s. And when it was automated, part of what was happening was that there were over 20-something different green cards in circulation, all with different security features. So of course, immigration officials at ports of entry were struggling to understand if a green card in front of them was actually legitimate, was actually reliable or not. So INS thought, well, let's automate this process because the machine will be more reliable. And in that sense, that's part of what how the human is taken into account in some of these systems. But it's the human as a source of failure. And it's also the human as a source of threat. And that's where questions of citizenship come into play. And how the non-citizen or the alien or the intruder, as the intrusion detection systems names them, becomes a source of menace. So I think I answered part of that question, but I can't find the question again in the Q&A. So hopefully that tackles some of it, Salvador. But I'm happy to answer more if you have other questions.
Yeah, I think you covered most of the questions. So Valerie, I understand you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much for such an insightful presentation, Professor Chaar López. I really like how your work dialogues with Professor Villanikolas's seminar on data borders that we had at the center a while back. So that was a great connection. And I was wondering, can you share how you navigated the challenge of writing about an object that has been really traditionally restrained from what you refer to as like the closed world of military research and technology? I'm really curious to know if the approach you took to investigate the cybernetics of border control shaped how you theorized about the technological regime at large. Thank you so much.
That's a fantastic question, Valerie. I love questions about method. So when I started this project, I started with an object, and the object was the drone. That's all I knew. That's all I had was I was collecting materials on drones and trying to keep track of the conversation. And one day I read an article on drones being used for border control, and I was like, oh, this is unusual. I've never heard about this. This doesn't circulate much in the press. So what's the history of this? How did this happen? And slowly I started doing research, and then I went, of course, I'm trained as a historian, so I went into the archives, I went to the Library of Congress, went to DHS. They have a public-facing library. And in that library, I found materials on the green card and the automation of the green card. But I didn't have other materials for drone operations. So I emailed Border Patrol through the librarian at this archive, and they said, FOIA us. That's almost a verbatim. So being a grad student at that time, I'm like, if I go through FOIA, that might end up being like years. So I figured, how else can I understand how these systems are being used? So I started looking into congressional reports. I started looking into any public-facing materials published by companies like General Atomics. I found another archive that had historical drones, and then I found that these drones were used for military exercises in the borderlands, not for border enforcement proper. So then I started noticing, oh, I can find there are other ways into the conversation about how drones ended up being at the border. And then it became a challenge of figuring out, well, how can I understand all of them together? And that's when thinking about them through techno-scientific scenes come into play, and thinking about them as variations on a theme or variations on a way of understanding an object. And yeah, that's part of what I did. And I'm being in American Studies. I was trained in American Studies at Michigan. So the popular also comes into play. So I look into film, I looked into art, I looked into a slew of other materials that would, again, from a different vantage point, speak of the same object, but maybe say things in a slightly different way. And yeah, I'm very much informed and influenced like by Deleuze and Guattari's work. So I tend to operate very rhizomatically. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. We have time for one last question. Mora, I understand you had a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Iván. This was super interesting. I have a question that's related perhaps to Tomás' question at the beginning about the emergence of probabilistic thought. I wonder, how do you think that recent developments of AI, for instance, regarding natural language processing, can actually shape how the electronic fence and the cybernetic border more broadly is constructed? Do you think that this quote unquote new technology may significantly impact the logistics of perception, and in what ways? Thank you so much.
That's a fantastic question, Mora. It's a huge question, in part because if we start to think about machine learning, we would also need to start to think about the kind of the labor that goes into producing these models and producing these systems. And in that capacity, I would say that it is fundamentally transforming the cybernetic border. Because I would then start to think about, well, what goes into producing AI and how, for example, the precarious labor of folks in Kenya doing like data cleaning and data tagging and all that is informing the production of the cybernetic border. And that is kind of embedded, invisible labor that produces that. And then in what capacity, if it happens, I don't know if some of these workers, because I know there are some of these data cleaning operations that are happening in Latin America. I mean, are some of these workers maybe thinking about migrating, and then they migrate and then they go into the position of maybe producing the technology that's that watches them, that produces their control. So there are all these things that are like a potential. So I would see I would think of this as a rich new line of inquiry, but I don't have. That's not quite what I'm doing in my work. But I do think that there's something new there, even if it's building off of prior processes of a probability, of making up people, and all that.
Thank you very much, Iván. This was a spectacular talk, really, really well crafted, and a very exciting new project. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. Thank you, Tomás, for great moderation. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us for next week's installment of this virtual seminar series. Once again, Iván, thanks a lot.
Thank you all so much.
Have a great week.
You as well.
Thank you.